Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Agersfar Saga and the Spoken Books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 4. Where did they catch him? Baz asked. Although the Conservator's chapel was practically beneath Xavier Tower, the roads in this part of Erstwhile twisted and wound about, so it was still a bit of a walk to get there. The tower had once been the manor of Helfax Erstwhile, the city's founder and one of the three great scribes. By all accounts, he'd been a miserable man, locked in his tower for most of his life writing books, which sounded even more boring than Baz's mundane existence. Though some stories did say Erstwhile had cared for a crippled brother, so he couldn't have been all, stop that. Out on Romance Road, not too far from Paper Ferry, Leanna replied. Baz rolled his eyes. Don't call it that. What? Romance Road. The ghost of a smile touched Leanna's lips. It's a fine story that Helfax Erstwhile had the thing built just so he could visit Leamina Fortune at her city on the ocean vast. It's a child's fairy tale, Baz said. Well, I think it's nice. It's good for children to know that two of the most important people to have ever lived had lives beyond saving all of Oration at the burning. Baz considered pointing out that not everyone thought the burning had been all warm sunsets and fireflies, but decided against it. Conservators were fervent in their worship of the scribes. Well, I think children ought to be taught facts, like that the real reason Helfax Erstwhile ordered construction of the Great Road was for the same reason anyone does anything: money. He wanted a faster way for his wagons to reach Fortune City, and Tome, well, when that was still a city anyway. A few hundred miles through unpaved wilderness isn't a fun or fast trip on a wagon. How would you know? Leanna said, eyes sparkling. You've never been outside Erstwhile's walls. Baz began to say his worldliness, or lack thereof, was entirely irrelevant to knowing the discomfort of riding in a wagon, but as they turned a corner, Xavier Tower came into view. Sorry to end this rousing discussion of romance, religion, and fiction, but we're almost there. Maybe we should get back to the part where you tell me what's going on with the cityless. For a moment, it appeared that Leanna intended to argue further, but then a smile replaced the frown on her face. Fine, Leanna said. I'll let you have this argument, for now, but it's going to cost you later. Baz sighed. She was always saying things like that. Whenever he made a point that was clearly the right one, she wouldn't concede. She'd just look coy and say something cryptic, as if he hadn't won the debate at all. Funny thing was, when she did that, he somehow ended up feeling like he hadn't. Sometimes Baz wondered if she wasn't from Enigma, with the way she could cut words and make him feel things he'd no intention of feeling. So, the cityless. Isn't the table's standing order to, eradicate on first contact, or whatever flowery language the barristers decided to use? Why did Actually, who is it that brought him here? The Conservators, said Leanna, voice growing thoughtful. One of their pilgrimages out to Fable, to see where the paper used to be made. Whoa, Baz said, furrowing his brow. That makes even less sense. No offense, but you Conservators tend to be even less tolerant of the cityless than ordinary folks, what with their crazy stories about living scribes and a return to the old ways. Leanna shrugged. Can you blame us? Imagine what it'd mean if that were true. That there are still living bound who can write new books. It really would be a return to the old ways. It's bad enough the occasional speaker figures out how to read. Can you imagine one making books? Leanna shivered. Baz grimaced, taking care not to look at her. After all, she wasn't intentionally trying to make him feel uncomfortable. Nearly everyone in Erstwhile felt as she did. It would be pretty awful, I suppose, Baz said, but I still don't... This one can read, Leanna interrupted. Oh, Baz said, eyebrows rising. Then, As the full import of that struck him, he repeated, "Oh, yeah," Leanna nodded. "The pilgrimage saw him using a spoken book to fend off a pack of wolves along the western shore of the deeps. He managed to toss the book into the lake before they caught him. A shame they weren't able to confiscate it." "Where do you suppose he learned to read?" "No idea," Leanna said, biting her lip. "That's one of the reasons Master Restorer Breneton and the others you saw at the chapel were so uptight." "I thought that's just how they were," Baz said, grinning. Leanna didn't return the smile. "This is serious, Baztian. A cityless who can read? Where could such a vagabond possibly have learned it? That's why they brought him back. They need to find out who taught him, so they can stop it from happening again." "Root out the blasphemer who taught him, eh?" "Exactly." Baz whistled under his breath. "Poor bloke." Leanna snorted in a decidedly unladylike manner. "Nothing poor about it. He's a criminal." Baz shrugged. "And I suppose Deliritous needs me because a representative from each of the libraries is required to be present for the questioning?" Leanna nodded. It figured. Hopes of something interesting dashed again. Just another criminal being put to the question. The Duke sometimes had multiple of those a week. Maybe it'd be a little different seeing a conservator do the torturing, but Baz doubted it. Usually, the actual torture was a fruitless exercise. Either the mere threat of it got the interrogator what he or she wanted, or the subject wouldn't talk at all until reaching the breaking point, at which time it was just as likely he was simply saying what you wanted as the actual truth. Deliritous almost certainly had Delilah with him, his creator. She would do anything he needed during the questioning, but Deliritous would burn pages before he made a public appearance with only one speaker, and the Duke was unlikely to permit him to take any of the Duke's own speakers to an event as mundane as a questioning. Torchsire had few enough as it was compared to the other libraries, and none would be making any money standing about at a questioning. So Baz was merely being summoned to serve as political capital, an object to show that Torchsire wasn't completely destitute. That realization turned his mood in a hurry, and he walked the rest of the way to Xavier in silence. When they arrived, the guards at the door were from the Conservatory, alluding to the questioning being conducted within. They nodded to Leanna and glared at Baz, but let them both pass without comment. They were ordinary guards, not harbors like rocks, but between the hooded white habits that cast their faces in shadow and the thickness of the forearms folded over their chests, Baz wouldn't have wished to say anything that might annoy them. An enforcer of the Conservatory was perhaps the only person in oration who could even hope to stand up to a Harbour. They stepped into a vast, non-agonal entry hall. A pair of large banners hung upon each wall. One was crimson and purple, showing the outline of a tower, the sigil of Xavier Library. The other was of Helfax Erstwhile's dragon, though unlike the symbol on Baz's robes. This one was a red outline on a white background, marking it as the flag of Erstwhile, rather than the black and red symbol of destruction. The hall's center was occupied by a spiraling staircase that led up to the tower's peak. Baz had climbed it several times to attend table meetings with Deliritous, an experience his legs would prefer to forget. Thankfully, rather than ascending, Leanna led him down to the basement. Questionings always seemed to be done in basements. It wouldn't be seemly to do them above ground, what with the risk of the screams carrying to the ears of ordinary citizens. "Nothing to see here, my good people." When they reached the questioning chamber, a round stone room lit by mirrored stand lamps, it seemed they'd already missed most of the proceeding. A man who Baz assumed was the cityless in question, as evidenced by his hands hanging from the ceiling by an old, rusty chain so that his toes barely touched the floor, stood at the room's center, head lolling to one side. His bare chest displayed the marks of multiple, implements of the truth-finding process, or so the conservators called them. A conservator in a crimson and purple habit, marking him as a Xavier Librarian, was droning on with questions, though the cityless seemed to be doing a poor job of answering in Baz's estimation, judging by his semi-conscious state. Leanna drifted away from Baz towards several other conservators. The rest of the men and women in the room were representatives of each of Erstwhile's 9 libraries, arrayed in a roughly circular fashion around the cityless. None were the actual dukes or duchesses of their respective libraries, who rarely left their own domains save for formal meetings of the Table of Enya, which this was not. Each library's group of representatives was made up of 3 to 5 individuals: a reader, who was the true representative of his or her library, the reader's Harbour, and 1 to 3 speakers. Generally, it was considered arrogant to go about with more than one speaker of each branch of the Trinity, sort of the reader's equivalent of announcing for all the world to hear how much money one made. The readers were easy to pick out, as they were the only ones wearing hats. That was another game they seemed to play, attempting to out-hat one another. Each one seemed wider brimmed than the next, adorned with colored feathers of ridiculous length. And if the hats weren't enough to clearly mark out the readers, then the mobile lecterns strapped to their shoulders and hanging before their chests certainly were. These small platforms permitted them to read while keeping their hands free. Baz could identify the library to which each individual reader belonged from the sigils on their robes: the Crimson Tower of Xavier, Charging Stallion of Kolnar, Axe of Exgal, Running Man of Mahan, Fish of Prashat, Alchemical Flask of Osenkai, Spirit Barrel of William, Gavel of Freedlaw, and, of course, the Crossed Torches of Torchsire. But beyond their home libraries, Baz could name few of them. Hellar Xavier, heir to the Xavier Library, was the only one Baz could definitively identify by name, and that was only because Deliritous hadn't stopped talking about him for weeks. He was one of only 2 other entrants besides Deliritous himself competing in the Acktus Trials this year. Well, that, and the fact he was likely the most famous reader in Erstwhile, being heir to its largest library. Hellar had short, dark hair, pale eyes that reminded Baz of a dying fish, and a smile upon which Baz hoped he was never on the receiving end. He actually had 5 speakers with him. They were in his library, so that wasn't as bold as going out in public with 5, but still. The Xavier heir was positioned just beside the Cityless, leaning close to another man and whispering into his ear, occasionally glancing to a spoken book that was open upon the lectern hanging from the harness around his shoulders. The man to whom Hellar was reading had a mustache that showed some gray, and a head that was bald instead of merely shaved, the Enigma's scales branded on his forehead. The man's name was Trunnell, and he was Hellar's influencer. The rarest of the 3 types of bound, influencers were useful for everything from turning trade deals in one's favor to convincing people to reveal their deepest secrets. Baz had spent many a long afternoon waiting outside rooms with other speakers while readers met in private session about one thing or another, and he'd chatted with Trunnell a few times. He'd been entertaining enough, a quick wit and a dry sense of humor. Now, though, he was intensely focused on the Cityless, repeating the words Hellar read in a quiet, rhythmic chanting. Sweat glistened on his bald head. True mind control was nearly impossible on all but the weakest of men, and generally a man that weak would be dead before you could control him. But the spells of an influencer could push all but the strongest of wills in the speaker's desired direction. That the Cityless still appeared to be holding out under the combined strain of the Conservator's torture and Trunnell's influence was impressive. Every now and again, the questioner glowered in Hellar's direction, as if blaming him for the lack of substantive responses he was obtaining. Or perhaps it was just a bit of the general tension between conservators and readers. Baz certainly didn't get involved in politics, but one would have to be blind, deaf, and likely dead to miss that it peeved the conservators to no end that, though they knew the languages of the Trinity, they had no speakers of their own. The readers had yet to cede such privilege to the Conservatory, and likely never would. Baz looked about the rest of the chamber. The only other reader he recognized was a representative from Kolnar Library. Maya? Something like that. Kolnar was a middling library, probably one of the few with which Torchsire could legitimately argue it competed in terms of size, and Mara was niece to the library's Duchess. She would also be competing in the trials, and Deliritous had rambled as much about her as he had Hellar. Her lips kept trying to twitch into a grin as she watched the Cityless squirm in his bindings, the fingers of her right hand playing over the pommel of a dagger at her belt. Baz grimaced and looked away, thinking not for the first time how glad he was that it wouldn't be him who accompanied Deliritous on the trials to compete against the likes of her. Baz's eyes finally found Deliritous, and by the look on his face, he'd been trying to get Baz's attention for some time. Deliritous motioned for him to come over, the frustrated urgency in the gesture not quite befitting one who was destined to take over a library of Erstwhile. Baz drew moderate looks of disdain from a few of the readers as he circled around the room's perimeter, though most simply ignored him. The Harbours of each reader, of course, paid him keen attention, ensuring he posed no threat to their charges. What they thought he could possibly do unarmed and being half their size, he didn't know, but they stared at him all the same, which supplied far more motivation to move quickly than the glares from Deliritous. None were as large as rocks, but they were still huge, and they all had the obligatory razors slung over their shoulders and leather masks covering their noses and mouth, leaving just their disturbingly lifeless eyes to track him across the room. Baz further increased his pace. The Conservator was still making demands of the non-responsive Sidulus when Baz reached Deliritous, so he pulled up beside the Torchsire heir without speaking, not wishing to risk even the possibility of earning a penance. For a time, he simply stood there observing the questioning. Baz didn't care what Leanna said. He felt sorry for the Sidulus. If it was true what Leanna had said and he was a cuss, they'd be burning him anyway. You burned books to destroy them, so that's what conservators did to cusses as well. If there was any logic in that, Baz had yet to hear it, but there it was. Regardless, if they hadn't gotten useful information from him by now, they likely wouldn't be getting any. Put the man out of his misery and move on. "I say, Baztian," Deliritous said in a low tone, though not so low that nearby readers didn't turn angry glares at him. "Couldn't you have gotten here a bit faster? I was the only reader with one speaker. Even Kolnar brought a pair." Baz glared back at Deliritous a moment before catching himself and looking to the side. Delilah stood next to him, casting an annoyed glare of her own at him. She was pretty, he supposed. That is, if you liked your women too thin, too tall, and too blonde, and had a predisposition for mulish faces. That was apparently precisely what Deliritous liked. Delilah's room was right next to Baz's in the library's basement, but her near-perpetual absence from it at night strongly suggested she was sleeping elsewhere. "Sorry, Master Deliritous," Baz muttered, grimacing as he noted that their brief exchange had drawn several more heated looks, including from a conservator standing beside the one asking questions. His sleeves were rolled up, hands stained red, his white habit splattered in crimson to match. Baz shuddered at the sight of him. A vicar. Officially, vicars were conservators dedicated to studying the mysteries of the scribes, but everyone knew they were also well versed in the more advanced methods of getting men to answer questions that needed answering. "Where were you?" Deliritous demanded, apparently oblivious to the stares. "Where was I?" Baz hissed, trying not to draw further attention. "Busy running an errand that could have just as easily been carried out by an ordinary servant." Deliritus's face contorted into what would have been called a pout on the face of anyone other than the heir to one of the city's libraries. "Well, I hadn't any other productive use for you at the time. I figured I'd have you do something rather than sit idly around the library." Baz knew for a fact there'd been a speaking scheduled for that morning, and chances were at least one of the supplicants would have desired something calling for a destructive spell. But Baz didn't bother arguing. "So you obtained the supplies for my journey?" Deliritous asked. "Oh, well, no." "No? Why not?" Baz's sigh drew looks from half the room, though he didn't immediately notice. "Well, there was a door, and a helpless man, and an annoying girl who told me you needed me immediately. So—" "Reader Torchsire," said the vicar, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Perhaps you'd care to include us in your conversation, seeing as how most of the room can already hear it?" Deliritous reddened. In a voice that broke halfway through the sentence, he said, "No, Vicar Vintas, I apologize for the interruption." "Oh, it's no bother," Vintas said, his tone of voice suggesting otherwise, "though I do think you've nicely pointed out that this line of questioning has grown stale. Perhaps a new tactic? Might we borrow the services of your Harbour for a moment?" Deliritus's expression almost became a scowl before smoothing into one of gracious submission. Requesting the use of another's Harbour was sort of like asking someone for help moving a large piece of furniture. No one ever wanted to say yes, but you were inevitably left looking like a cuss if you said no. Of course, Vicar. Rocks? Deliritous turned to, and looked up at, the Harbour. Please go assist the Vicar, yes? Thank you. Rocks, unlike nearly everyone else in the room, had no compunctions at all regarding showing his emotions. His eyes indicated just how he felt about leaving his reader's side for even a moment. But after his bald head swiveled back and forth several times, confirming there were no apparent threats within proximity of Deliritous, he complied and lumbered forward to stand by the Cityless. Hellar and Trunnell backed away to make room for him, Hellar's gray eyes studying Rocks like he was a particularly interesting bit of architecture. Thank you, Vintas said, his voice writhing like maggots in an apple, and his eyes gleaming with what seemed almost ecstasy as they turned to consider the Cityless. Now, Harbour, if you would, lift his head up for me. Rocks grunted and yanked up on the chain holding the Cityless until his chin lifted off his chest. Let's try again, Vintas said. Where did you learn to read? The Cityless groaned. I told you. The home of the scribes. Home of the scribes? Baz said under his breath. Tome, Deliritous said without taking his eyes off the Cityless. Now be quiet. Baz imagined glaring at Deliritous. Well, he imagined far worse things than simply glaring at him, but he kept his eyes straight ahead as well. Clearly, the torture had driven the Cityless completely mad. Tome had been razed over 300 years ago, now little more than a big pile of rubble. Vintas sighed as if he were being made to do something he didn't wish to do, though the glow in his eyes said otherwise. He made his way over to a table arrayed with many sharp instruments, several of which showed signs of recent use. His lips pursed, as if dissatisfied with the selection. Then he turned to the readers and motioned to the Cityless with a dramatic sweep of his arm. Does anyone have a knife I might borrow? Almost instantly, the reader from Kolnar Library stepped forward, holding out the dagger Baz had observed her caressing. She was no longer hiding her smile, looking eagerly from her blade to the Cityless and then back to the Vicar. Something's not quite right about her, Deliritous muttered. For once, Baz found he agreed with the Torchsire heir. Ah, Reader Marla of Kolnar Library, Vintas said formally. I thank you. He gave her a small bow, then took the dagger and turned back to the unfortunate prisoner. Marla stepped back to her place, eager eyes never leaving the man hanging from the ceiling. We know lies when we hear them, Cityless, Vintas said. No one has lived in Tome since the burning. We send readers there every year. They see the occasional dragon, but no men, and certainly no one who could teach you to read. Now, one more chance. Where did you learn to read? The Cityless groaned, his chin falling back to his chest once more. The Vicar's face curled into a grim smile. Harbour, hold him taut. Rocks grunted again and yanked up on the chain. Then things began to happen very quickly. The rusty chain snapped in Rox's hand, the unexpected loss of tension sending Rox hurtling backwards. Startled, the Vicar also reeled back, dropping the knife as he did. The room seemed to collectively inhale for a moment and hold its breath, except for the Cityless. The Declaimer's transcendence, he cried out like a madman. He'll speak the words to set us free. What in the burning did that mean? Baz had no time to ponder it. The ends of the broken chains were still locked around the Cityless's wrists. Swinging his arms around his head, he lashed out at the nearest reader, which just so happened to be Deliritous. Now, Deliritous deserved some credit. He wasn't too bright, and generally not good at much of anything, but he had taken fencing lessons, as all readers did. His reflexes were quick, and he ducked the chain. So instead, it struck Delilah square in the throat. The blow lifted her off the ground, throwing her several paces back before she crashed to the stone floor. An instant later, the Cityless had the Vicar's dropped knife in hand and was charging at Deliritous. The Torchsire heir made the excellent defensive maneuver of holding his arms out in front of him and letting out a sound that was half scream, half whimper. Baz glanced to Rox. The huge man was still peeling himself off the pavers. He wouldn't get to Deliritous in time. Visions of his wildest dreams coming true flooded Baz's mind. Deliritous dead. Just what the idiot deserved. Finally, payback for what he'd done to Tax. No one else in the room was making any move to help Deliritous either. The gathered readers would gladly watch one of their competitors struck down. Baz ought to have felt satisfaction at that, Deliritous falling victim to the same societal mores that had victimized Baz's brother. But instead, Baz found a hollow emptiness in his gut. Baz stuck out a foot into the Cityless's path, sending him sprawling. His saving act was nearly wasted as the knife went flying from the Cityless's hand and whistled past Deliritous' left ear. Deliritous gave another scream-cry moan and fell away from the dagger, though the reaction was so delayed as to be comical. The Cityless pushed himself back to his feet, disoriented and looking about. A moment later, his face was introduced to Rox's razor. Now, if you've never seen a man punched in the face by a Harbour's razor, it likely isn't something you wish described to you. The weapon struck right above the bridge of the Cityless's nose, literally taking off the top of his head. But the razor in its one-handed form isn't a straight-edged weapon like a sword, but rather jagged like a saw, so the Cityless's scalp wasn't so much sheared off as exploded off, showering gore over everyone within 10 yards. A small part of Baz's mind further noted that Rox's hand ended up breaking the Cityless's nose, but that hardly seemed notable given his other injuries. Despite his delayed reaction to the knife, Deliritous was the first of the crowd to recover from the shock, running over to the fallen Delilah. He knelt beside her, cradling her head on his lap. A black bruise had already sprung up on her neck. "Oh, Delilah!" Deliritous cried. "Speak to me!" Baz had just assumed she was dead. He certainly didn't think he would have survived getting whipped in the throat by a heavy chain. But at the sound of her name, Delilah stirred, lifting her head and opening her eyes. She opened her mouth, grimaced, then spit out a tooth before responding. "'Sall right, Deliritous," she slurred. "Aim fine." And Deliritous, showing just how much he cared for Delilah, cried in response, "Oh, your voice! What will I do for the trials if you can't speak?" Somewhere in the crowd of readers, Marla Kolnar laughed. All right. Welcome back to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is February 2nd, 2022. As I record this, episode 4 of the book club. We'll start with my personal update here, as we do every week, before we launch into our discussion of Chapter 4 of the Acktus Trials. I had a bit of a script written out for this, but I think I'm going to go off the cuff here a little. Actually, we'll go behind the curtain early today. I got about a week-long process for producing each episode right now. I'll probably get a little more efficient as time goes on, but for now, usually I spend a day or two writing the script, and then I record the reading on one day, so the actual narration of the book. And then I record this analysis, usually the following day, sometimes the same day if it's a shorter reading. But usually I'm pretty wiped after doing the reading. That takes a lot of concentration and some frustration too, depending on how well or not well I'm doing the reading that day. And then I have to edit the video the next day. So what is that? 4 or 5 days to get the one episode out. So I wrote this script that I'm using. You know, I partially read off the script and then partially, just go off on tangents as well. But the big thing that happened to me last week was this is the first podcast I'm releasing when the Acktus Trials has actually been released. This podcast actually came out for all of you out there to listen to when the Acktus Trials was already available, but I'd recorded the first few episodes before the book actually released. So this is the first post-release podcast I'm doing, and I'm kind of in the post-release letdown here now. There's so much to do leading up to the release. It's like my to-do list is is endless. There's always one more thing to get right, or one more piece of data to enter. Geez, I had to remake or regenerate the audio or the ebook file like 5 or 6 times because I kept finding one little thing that was wrong with it. And you can't just go in and edit the audiobook. You have to go edit the Word document and then convert it. And very exciting the day it actually it came out. And I still don't have my own physical copy of it yet. I'm waiting. I ordered my author copies from Amazon and Ingram Spark. They send those to me at cost, but of course they don't give you fast shipping for those. So I actually got a text from one of my friends with a photo of my book. He has it in hand before I do. But I guess that's one of the downsides to being self-published, right? For those who don't know, I don't have to buy boxes and boxes of physical books. That's not something any authors have to do anymore. There are print-on-demand services now that do work for the major retailers like Amazon. Well, Amazon has its own. Then Ingram Spark does it for other places like Barnes & Noble. And when a customer orders one of my books, those services just print one and ship it to whoever ordered it. So if you're not too in tune with how publishing is working these days, that's kind of a relatively recent, in the past decade, innovation in that regard. But like I said, the release exciting, but now I'm a little bit of the letdown. There aren't really like fireworks or anything that go off after the release. It's just on to the next thing here, particularly for me, since I'm still kind of early on here in my author journey. The Acktus Trials is the second novel that I've published, though I do have 2 more coming out in a few months. I wrote the first 3 books of the series all back to back last year without releasing any of them, and now I'm releasing them in kind of quick succession here. So it's a it's a long road, and especially for self-published authors, it's you have to have several books in a series before you really start seeing serious traction in the market. So I will carry on, and I am thankful to all of you out there who are listening now, because you're on the train here just as it's coming out of the station. So in a few years, when I'm hopefully a big famous self-published author here, you can say you were here at the beginning of the book club. So thanks for listening, and why don't we launch into our analysis here of Chapter 4 now. One thing I'm going to try to do here, I haven't done it yet because, as I just told you, I haven't done the video editing yet, but I'm going to try to start tossing some names up on the screen as I introduce new characters. I had a listener who suggested I start doing that, and I thought that was a good idea, because a lot of these names are obviously not familiar to you, like Pront v. Lextor in the prologue there. And I guess if you've been paying attention, you've seen him mentioned a few other times already too. But so let me know if that's helpful when I start doing that on the video here for this episode 4. And I think I'll try to throw the names down into the show notes as well too, if you're not watching on YouTube, so you'll have that for you as well. Or you could always pick up your own copy of the book and follow along. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine too. We're gonna keep reading it here on the podcast free of charge, so never fear. Okay, so I'm gonna go a little bit out of order here on the analysis. Let's talk about this cityless person first, because that's kind of what the chapter revolves around, even though Baz and Leanna diverge a little bit from that at the start of the chapter here. So, right off the bat, we learned that the table, right, which is Erstwhile's government, made up of a duke or duchess from each of the 9 libraries. I guess maybe it hasn't come right out and said it yet, but, there's 9 libraries, and each of them is headed by either a duke, who is obviously a man, or a duchess, who would be a woman. So 9 leaders at the table of Enya, which I came up with that because Enneagon is a 9-sided shape for those of you wondering. Right. So the table, the government of Erstwhile, has this standing order to kill any of these cityless on sight. Apparently, as Baz puts it, they have crazy stories about living scribes and a return to the old ways. Leanna clarifies that this means that they advocate for a return to days where men could read, speak, and, heaven forbid, write new spoken books. Leanna is clearly disturbed by the very prospect of that, and I guess that shows too why the Erstwhile's government has such a harsh stand to these folks, right? They kind of stand for pretty much the opposite of what the readers want, which is this separation of powers between the readers who can't wield magic and the speakers who are able to pull the magic out of the spoken books but do not know how to read. The readers want to have this monopoly over the power. And, we saw what happened when that monopoly is, when someone tries to break that monopoly with poor Baz's brother in the first couple of chapters there. And, Leanna's vehemence here kind of, it unsettles Baz a little, right? And, he has to tell himself that she wasn't intentionally trying to make him feel uncomfortable because, basically everyone in the society feels like Leanna. They are, we saw how the illit that Baz interacted with last week reacted when Baz implied that he might be able to read. No one wants to be accused of being able to read unless you're a reader at the top of society. But Baz probably has a bit of a special reason to feel unsettled here, right? Like, what's he referring to? And, he's one of those individuals that Leanna finds so disturbing, right? We haven't come back to this yet, but we saw in the prologue that, he at least is learning the basics of reading. It's unclear what, if anything, he's done to further that since the unfortunate incident with his brother in the speaking room 10 years ago. But there it is. Baz is hiding this secret, and we're laying some seeds here for tension in the future, right? Because Leanna and Baz seem to they seem to at least be friends, right? Maybe something more. We'll talk about that in a minute here. But Leanna's a conservator, right? And she hates cusses even more than the rest of society in general. It seems they're particularly out to enforce the separation of power. So we're gonna have to keep an eye on that as the story progresses. Baz is keeping this secret from her that she's not gonna like. But okay, so then we move on here, and Leanna drops the real bombshell of the chapter, and that's that this cityless apparently can read. He is bound, right? Which means he was born able to draw power from the spoken books. So all speakers are bound. They are bound to the books. And since he is bound and knows how to read, that means he is a cuss. He can pull the magic from the books out on his own. He doesn't need someone to read them to him. And kind of paradoxically, that's why they didn't execute him on the spot, because they want to figure out where he learned to read. So it sounds like they are questioning him over at Xavier Tower to figure that out. And that's where Baz is headed. So he's about to see what happens, right? What happens to someone like him, or what will happen to him if someone discovers his secret. Front row seats to the consequences of that. And we also learn here, Baz has been summoned because each of the libraries has to apparently have a representative present at this questioning of the cityless, and that really puts a damper on Baz's excitement. He's not, and kind of oddly here, he's not even really dwelling on the fact that it's because he's going to see what happens to someone like him, which maybe implies that Baz isn't really maybe he hasn't been doing much reading lately, because he doesn't have a super visceral reaction on a personal level. He's more just like bored with it, right? It's just another criminal being put to the question. He's being real cavalier about it here, because apparently this happens all the time in Erstwhile. More evidence that this isn't such a great place to be living, right? Unless you're one of these few elite readers in the upper caste of society here. And probably shows a little bit of the good soul he's hiding beneath all of this sarcasm too. he shares what he thinks of torture, not too high on it, right? And it's like, either the mere threat gets the victim to talk, or by the time they break, they're just willing to say anything. So he's obviously on the side of torture is at least on the side that it's a waste of time, if not against it for other reasons. And Baz is also kind of depressed here because originally, a cityless. I've never even seen one of those before. This will be interesting. But he's really just being summoned because we learned that Deliritous would burn a page, right? Burn a page before he makes a public appearance with only one speaker. Another one of these fun turns of phrase about bad things happening to books. He would rather do something abhorrent in this society, him being Deliritous, than be seen without his retinue in public. So, and again, if you have any ideas for fun book-based curses like I use here in the Acktus Trials, shoot me an email and I'll share those on a future episode. You can get your 10 seconds of fame here on D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. All right, so like I said, a bit out of order because the chapter starts here, with this kind of back and forth between Baz and Leanna. They're kind of proven to be quite a pair, right? What little we know about Leanna so far, she seems pretty driven and optimistic about things. Remember last week we learned about how she really wants to get promoted and kind of move up the ranks in the Conservatory. And this story she tells certainly shows her optimism, whereas we've got Baz, who is sarcastic and kind of abrasive, right? And he's like the Brillo pad of characters here so far. And Leanna also befuddles him a bit. What does she say here? Oh yeah, whenever he made a point that was clearly the right one, she wouldn't concede. And somehow he ended up feeling like he hadn't won the debate at all. Maybe, she puts his, she spins his mind around it. It seems here. So, doesn't think quite straight around Leanna all the time. So, like I said, they're having this conversation at the beginning. We get a link back to the prologue, right? Leanna mentions Leamina Fortune and Helfax Erstwhile. And, they were the two who Pront v. Lextor mentioned at the beginning of the book to the Book Dragon, right? He said they fell, right? They fell fighting whatever it was that was threatening the Great Library there in the prologue. And we learned that they were founders of the two major cities of Oration, right? Obviously we're in Erstwhile, and Helfax Erstwhile. So obviously he's the founder of the city we're in now. And, extra credit here if you picked up on, Leamina Fortune, right? That's where Pront v. Lextor told the Book Dragon to take that book in the prologue, right? Yeah, the book has to get to Fortune safely, or something along those lines. Pront tells the Book Dragon in the prologue. And, Leanna makes, she says they were two of the most important people who have ever lived because they saved all of Oration at the burning. So they didn't just die fighting there at the Great Library. They did something that helped save Oration from the burning. And that's another connection there too, right? Mentioning the burning, a little subtle, but not too hidden, right? Pretty good evidence that whatever it was that was happening in the prologue, it was probably an event from this burning. And we first saw that referenced last week, some sort of disaster that happened in the past. So we're kind of putting into context a little, what was happening in that prologue, and also that the prologue happened quite a bit in the past from where we are now, because we learned that the burning happened, several hundred years ago in the main story here. And we also learned that Pront had, we've already established Pront had a connection with Leamina and Helfax, right? Right, so we know these three were important, but, just how important were they? And, we learn, Baz, I think it's Baz, yeah, Baz tells us, right? He says Helfax Erstwhile was one of the three great scribes, right? And, the conservators were praying to the scribes in last week's episode, back in Chapter 3. And Baz says again, in reference to Lianna, the conservators were fervent in their worship of the scribes. And we also know the scribes are the ones who created the spoken books. So we've got some puzzle pieces falling into place now about kind of the world's lore and backstory here. There were the three scribes. We know Helfax was one of them, the founder of the city of Erstwhile. And, I think it's a pretty safe bet Leamina and Pront v. Lextor were the other two scribes, right? So they're all treated like gods, at least by the conservators. And they were all at this calamity called the Burning. But, at least two of them, Leamina and Helfax, suffered some terrible fate there. And, at this point, we don't really know what happened to Pront v. Lextor. So this really drives home just how bad the burning must have been. The three scribes who they're at least thought of like gods, right? And they created the spoken books that hold this world's magic. So, even if they aren't true gods, they're certainly powerful individuals here. But even they weren't able to stop the burning. So just driving home how bad it must have been. We also get this quick story about the Romance Road, which is apparently also called the Great Road, which connects the cities of Erstwhile and Fortune. Liana's position in the argument is that Helfax Erstwhile built it just so he could go visit Mina Fortune at her city on the ocean vast. So she's got kind of a romantic perspective here, and it probably didn't come to any of you as much of a surprise where Baz isn't buying into this, right? It's a child's fairy tale, he says. The real reason Helfax Erstwhile built this road was the same reason anyone does anything: money. Baz doesn't seem to have much faith in really anyone here, does he? He's quite the sardonic character here, and though. Going down to the next level of that, beyond Baz's surface sarcasm, he does also reference that the Great Road connected not only Fortune and Erstwhile, but also Erstwhile and Tome. At least when Tome was a city, right? So, implying here that Tome is no longer a city. What happened to it? It seems like a pretty good bet that this burning event devastated Tome to the extent that, it's no longer considered a city today. I think Baz tells us at some point in this chapter it's really just a pile of rubble at this point. And, one other point here, one of Pront v. Lextor's titles was Librarian of Tome, right? Remember his string of titles back from the prologue. So, and we did establish that the prologue took place in Tome. That's mentioned a few times there, too. So Tome was someplace really important. And, then we had this big disaster there, and now it's not even a city anymore. So that's probably going to be pretty important here moving forward. So keep that in mind. We'll be hearing more about Tome here in the chapters to come. Anything else we want to talk about here before we head to Xavier Tower? Oh, just this note here that Baz has never been outside of Erstwhile's walls, right? So he has spent his whole life in this city. Lianna kind of makes fun of Baz here when talking about the road. Baz says something like, unpaved wilderness is no fun to travel over in a cart. And, Liana's like, well, how would you know? You've never done that. So, Baz, that's going to become relevant too. Baz, not the most worldly of people here, which I guess isn't a surprise. He is a slave. He's not taking vacations to exotic places or anything. All right, so I think that's enough of that. We kind of move on from Baz and Lianna walking to kind of the meat of the chapter here over at Xavier Tower. We get there and we immediately see that it's being guarded by guards from the Conservatory, right? And they are called enforcers, who are, apparently big dudes. They're kind of like Harbors, though Baz makes a point of saying, well, they're just ordinary guards. They're not Harbors, though in the next breath he is also like, well, a Conservatory enforcer is, the only person who might have a chance of standing up to a Harbor, right? So they're still pretty mean dudes that you don't want to mess with. And we see here, so it seems the Conservators have their own bodyguards, similar to the Readers, right? They have their enforcers, the Readers have their harbors. Okay, so we head downstairs to stairs. I don't know why I said it that way. They head downstairs to where the questioning is happening. One of my favorite quotes from Baz in the book here. Again, some criticism of torturing here. Questionings always seem to be done in basements. It wouldn't be seemly to do them above ground, what with the risk of the screams carrying to the ears of ordinary citizens. Nothing to see here, my good people. Oh, man. I don't know. Maybe you guys think some of Baz's comments here are a little cheesy, but, they make me laugh. So hopefully you get some chuckles out of them, too, while you're listening or reading along here. This poor guy, this Cityless, he's already, the Conservators have already been going at him for quite a while, right? When Baz arrives, his hands are chained up to the ceiling, right? He's kind of just hanging there, all stretched out, barely conscious. He's shirtless, and his chest is apparently all bloody. Again, Baz a little more obviously desensitized to this whole process a bit, but his chest is covered in marks of the truth-finding process. The city, Baz goes on. Well, he seemed to be doing a pretty poor job of answering, the interrogation questions, seeing as how he was barely conscious. So, Baz, he really not fazed by seeing someone get tortured here. Again, really, just seeing more of the bad side of this ruling class here in Erstwhile. If Baz has seen so many torture sessions that he right. I mean, there's a guy being tortured at the center of the room, and Baz is just kind of looking around at all the other readers, right? It's not even like a big deal for him. Another kind of interesting note here that, again, not dwelled on, but you can see how this kind of sets the stage for some tension here in this society. So we've got the and we'll get to the influencer reader here a little more in a second. But so we have the people from the Conservator, this vicar and another Conservator doing the questioning, but we've also got this influencer who is kind of using magic to try to convince this guy to answer the questions, right? But we know that the Conservators can read, right? But it's another reader who is reading to the influencer. So definitely see some tension here. Baz kind of comes right out and identifies it for us that, the Conservators would love to have their own speakers, but, the readers have not given them that privilege. Again, the readers are keeping this monopoly on their power. And you can certainly see, what with how, the important place the Conservatory obviously holds in society with the ability to keep the spoken books in good condition. There's probably some resentment there between the Conservators and the readers. And I wouldn't be surprised. And by not surprised, I mean, that's going to cause some problems in the future here. Obviously, I know. So, and this vicar guy too. So he's the head torturer, and I just got to say, I picture, with this guy, I kind of picture the torturer at the end of Braveheart. If you guys have seen Braveheart, he is. If you've seen Braveheart, you know what I'm talking about. This guy's just the worst. He's dressed up in his priest get up, and he's got his stringy, graying hair, and he's just the worst. Especially since he's the guy who kills poor old Braveheart there in the end. Spoiler, sorry if you haven't seen Braveheart, but I think that movie's old enough here, and based on history that happened like 1,000 years ago. So I don't really think that one needed a spoiler warning, but maybe I'll edit one back in. Anyway, okay. So Baz is down here in the basement with the torture going on, and we see some other readers here. This is really the first time we've seen other readers besides Deliritous, right? And he barely qualified back in Chapter 2 because he was still just a kid then. So now he's going to be in his early 20s. But before we get there, I do have a listener question here. Another one from Diane. Diane, thanks for all your participation here in the early going. And just a reminder, if anyone else has questions they'd like answered on the show, just shoot me an email, or you can drop one in the Facebook group as well. dtkane@dtkane.com or at dtkaneauthor on Facebook and Twitter. But Diane asks, DT, I'm still just a bit unclear on the difference between readers and speakers. Could you explain that a bit more? Sure, Diane. I know we haven't, up to this point, we haven't seen a bunch of interaction between the two, so I don't blame you, especially since I admit it's a little confusing, right? Because, the readers do also speak, as in they talk. They're reading, they are reading the words out loud. But remember it this way: the readers can read, right? And that's the thing in this society. Only a few people can do it, and it's the readers. That's the special thing that they can do. So they can read, but they are not bound to the spoken books, which means even though they can read the book's words, doing so doesn't produce any magic when they do it. They need to read the words to a speaker, who then repeats the words that are read to them, and then that results in the magic. Because, as we were mentioning a little earlier, the speakers are bound to the spoken books, which means they are born with the ability to pull the magical power out of them, and they could do it on their own if only they knew how to read. But they do not know how to read, which is how they are enslaved to the readers, and they can't cast any magic unless a reader first reads aloud a book to them. So I hope that cleared it up a little more for you, Diane, but definitely shoot me another email if you'd like to discuss that further. Right, so we got representatives from each of the 9 libraries down here, though none of them are dukes and duchesses, right? So apparently this hasn't been deemed important enough for them to attend, which I guess is kind of interesting, because Leanna was horrified, right, by this idea of the cityless who was able to read, but apparently the city's government isn't super concerned about it. None of the dukes or duchesses deemed this important enough to attend personally. So maybe a little more evidence of tension between the readers and the conservators here. Are the conservators more concerned than the readers in maintaining this acute separation of powers, or maybe, and that doesn't make too much sense, because obviously the readers really like holding as much power as they can. So maybe it's just the readers, they view the conservators here as a bit too zealous, maybe. They've cried wolf one too many times, perhaps. And the reader's like, oh, well, they're putting someone else to the question. I'll send Deliritous over to Xavier Tower, and he can report back. It's probably going to be a waste of time. And we also, quickly in passing here too, we learned the Conservatory doesn't have a seat at the table of Enya, right? The city's government. So, again, just more and more tension here. We've seen how powerful the Conservatory is, but they apparently don't even get to sit on the government here. All right, so the room's crowded here with all these readers and their their retinues. Every reader has their entourage, and we see a bit of like the keeping up with the Joneses type situation here, right? Readers apparently don't go out in public without their speakers and their harbors. And the harbor you can kind of understand, right? The harbor is their bodyguard. They're not going anywhere without them. But, it seems like, I was trying to think of a modern day analogy here. I guess it's kind of like going out in public without a speaker is sort of like going out with a cheap suit on, right? Technically, you've got your suit on, you're dressed right, but, everyone is still judging you behind your back. And that kind of seems how it is, you are showing your power when you bring your speakers out with you. Your slaves, basically. You're going out in public showing, I'm powerful enough to have my slaves here. So, kind of this unspoken competition here between all the nobles. We also see that in the way they dress, right? Only the readers wear hats, apparently. And Baz gives us Another quip here. That was another game they seemed to play, attempting to out-hat one another. Each one seemed wider brimmed than the next, adorned with colored feathers of ridiculous length. So again, kind of like I said in in part 1 with Deliritous hat, they got these giant, the giant floppy hats. Again, think like Three Musketeers hats. They're called Cavalier hats, right? They're these really big hats with the big feathers coming out. So obviously we got these. The readers are clearly wealthy and image obsessed, kind of like the typical nobles here. And they've also got this interesting fashion. I don't know if it's a fashion item, but certainly accessory. The mobile lecterns, right? That they use to hold spoken books. So it's like a tray that's suspended from a harness, so they can have a book and read it. If you're on YouTube, you kind of see me posing here a little. But read the book while having their hands free, kind of like a mini desk hanging from their necks. It's certainly a ridiculous thing for us to imagine here. But with how important books are in this society, you can see how this would kind of be something that arises. Especially, and we haven't seen readers fight yet. Spoiler: we're going to see a duel between readers in Chapter 5, so make sure you tune in next week for that. But if you're fighting and reading spells, you want to have your hands free, right? So, that's another justification for these mobile lecterns we see. So we go on and we meet, or at least we are introduced to a couple of specific readers, and I'll just go ahead and tell you that this isn't the last time you're going to see either of them. That's why I took the time to introduce them here. I'm not... Characters especially, I don't waste a lot of time, creating secondary and tertiary characters unless they're going to keep popping up. So that's, and that's a generalization, I would say. I'm sure I'll get a comment from someone, but on page 75 of book X, you made this character and you never showed up again. Well, I'm not talking in absolutes here, but I try not to, if I've got a guy who appears for like 1 second and then we never heard from him again, I probably don't even give him a name. So, there you go. That's a bit of my philosophy there. I'm not Stephen King, where I'll have a perspective shift to a character who you've never heard of before and then you never hear of again after 2 pages. So that's not my style, though. That's not throwing any shade at Mr. King, because obviously he's a little bit more successful than me. So, but I'm just saying that I don't do it that way. Okay, so Hellar Xavier, the heir to Xavier Library, which is Erstwhile's wealthiest library, right? So he's a pretty big deal here, and he's got five speakers. Baz tells us this is a bit of a social misstep, right? It's kind of like flaunting your wealth a little too openly here. So I guess Hellar is he's on his home turf here, so still maybe not quite as bit of a faux pas here as it otherwise would be, but we still see some arrogance going on with having so many speakers displayed to everyone around. And, if we suspected that maybe Baz's disdain for the reader stopped at Deliritous, he kind of debases us of that assumption. Wow. Debases us. It's one of those phrases that's hard to pronounce. I would have to go back and re-record that if I was doing the narration, but, Here we just press on here in the analysis. You're getting the raw first take audio here for the most part in the analysis section. But Baz describes Hellar. He has short, dark hair, pale eyes that reminded Baz of a dying fish, and a smile upon which Baz hoped he was never on the receiving end. So, another kind of unsettling description here. Though Baz doesn't have many flattering descriptions of really anyone here, right? Well, except Lianna, right? So maybe a little more evidence of how he feels about her. But anyway, back to Hellar here. We also get our first look at another type of speaker, right? So Baz is a destroyer, right? And we've got destroyers, creators, and influencers. And we see an influencer here. Hellar is actively engaged in reading a spell to his influencer as Baz enters. And, basically, influencers are capable of low-level mind control. Now, Baz quickly establishes there's limits here, right? You don't just speak a spell and you're pulling the strings of pulling. Oh, maybe this would be a good one for the YouTube thumbnail here, pulling the strings. Puppet Master DD Kane here. So, you don't just snap your fingers and make someone do whatever you want. Baz tells us, true mind control was nearly impossible on all but the weakest of men. And generally, a man that weak would be dead before you could control him. Seeing if your constitution is so bad that you could be 100% mind controlled, you're probably not breathing. But the spells of an influencer could push all but the strongest of wills in the speaker's desired direction. So kind of an apt name, influence. They are nudging you in the way the speaker wants. And it's sort of a frightening thought, this kind of society where this magic exists, right? You got to be constantly wondering, say you're negotiating with someone. And Baz, I think he does mention, influencers are used in trade, right? To kind of push trade deals in the directions you want to go. So you got to be constantly on alert. Geez, do they have an influencer hidden around the corner here somewhere? And of course, I'm trying to look around the corner of my monitor just to make sure I'm not being influenced right now. But you got to constantly be on alert for this stuff in this society. And I already made this point earlier. I had a note here just to point out how it's the conservator is doing the questioning, but it's still a reader. Reading the spoken book to the speaker, because again, the conservators do not get speakers. The readers are keeping monopoly on that. And then we do kind of see how Baz makes Baz doesn't make it a secret that he doesn't really pay attention too much to what goes on in day-to-day society. There's all these readers around, but the only one he can really identify at all is the one from Kolnar Library. And actually, it seems Baz only knows her because we learned that Hellar and then Marla Kolnar, the woman speaker here with the dagger, right? Pardon me. They are the two other competitors in the Acktus Trials that Deliritous is going to be going on. And of course, Deliritous has been rambling on about both of them. And we learned she's not too pleasant, right? She's enjoying watching this torture. She's trying to hide this smile, and she's petting this dagger of hers, right? Got a little Gollum with the ring going on here. While obviously Baz didn't care for Hellar, Marla seems to frighten him a bit. He doesn't even want to look at her. And, we kind of see why here in a little bit as we move on in the chapter. And, just another quick little thing here. I was trying to remember where I came up with Marla's name, and I don't remember this for sure, but I think I might have just lifted this out of Fight Club. I think I was just I was trying to think of a name where I could, you could inject a healthy dose of contempt into it, and just kept coming back to Edward Norton in Fight Club. Marla is the female character there, played by Helena Bonham Carter, right? That's her name in Fight Club in the movie. Anyway, but what's the quote there towards the beginning? If I did have a tumor, I'd name it Marla. Marla. So that's and that should give you an idea of where Marla's character is going here. You're gonna have lots of reason to feel contempt for her as we move on. Right. So we meet those couple of readers, and then Baz finally makes eye contact with Deliritous, right? And it doesn't seem too much has changed about Deliritous since we met him originally in Chapter 2, 10 years ago in book time. He's still a bit of a brat, it kind of seems, right? Still hasn't quite grasped how to act in accord with his station. Kind of our introduction to Deliritous here. Baz tells us, Deliritous motioned for him to come over, the frustrated urgency in the gesture not quite befitting one who is destined to take over a library of Erstwhile. Baz obviously doesn't have much respect here for Deliritous, right? It's not really Deliritous' angry glare that gets him to come over, but all these other harbors because once they see that Baz is there, they're all kind of staring at him, making sure he's not posing a threat and, being under their scrutiny, their lifeless eyes, right? Baz says, being under the scrutiny of their lifeless eyes. That's what makes them hurry over to Deliritous just to get out of their stares. And just like in Chapter 2, things only get worse for Deliritous once he opens his mouth. This is not an isolated incident. We're going to see this again. Deliritous would benefit from a little less talking in lots of situations here. Though even though Baz criticizes Deliritous for that, we'll see that Baz would probably benefit from that same evidence too. He has trouble keeping his mouth shut as well. Though here it's Deliritous who's getting them in trouble. In fact, we see Baz probably has a little more sense than Deliritous does here. This is an official function, right? A man is being tortured just a few steps away. And Baz has enough sense to remain silent, so he's not annoying the conservators. But, Deliritous is just, he just really starts whining, right? He starts whining to Baz about, why were you late? I only had one speaker with me. It was so embarrassing. Oh, Deliritous. Oh, you're such a wimp. It seems. And remember, like I said, I like Deliritous, but we're still we're not really warming up to him yet here. We also very quickly meet Delilah, who is a creator, though we don't really learn anything about creators at this point. But she is there with Deliritous already. She was the one speaker he had with him. He had with him before Baz arrived. And just more demerits against Deliritous. He apparently sleeps with Delilah, right? Baz doesn't come right out and say it, but he's like, well, she's never in her sleeping quarters, which are right down the hall from Baz's, so you can kind of imply what's happening there. So, Deliritous is one of these guys who, doesn't just, he uses his slaves for a variety of things here. So again, we're not casting him in a very good light. And then he just keeps going on and on, right? Baz is growing increasingly uncomfortable because, Deliritous is over here just going on about how Baz was late. And, all the readers are starting to glare at him, being like, what are you going on about over there, dude? And so we've got that, all the increasingly everyone just kind of glaring at him. Deliritous totally oblivious. We also do him, he kind of reaffirms a little what Leanna noted earlier, how he doesn't really want to use Baz, because he seems to think that, all he had to do for Baz that morning was have him run this errand, right? But, Baz is like, well, I know there was a speaking scheduled for this morning, you couldn't have, you don't think anyone needed a destructive spell at that, at the speaking earlier today? So, and Baz notes that the library has ordinary servants, right? So presumably that means ones who don't have the ability to draw power from the books. So, this probably isn't the best example, but, think of we have a guy who runs an auto repair shop and he's constantly sending out his best mechanic to pick up groceries, right? Rather than work on the cars. So there does seem to maybe be some truth here to Leanna's theory. Deliritous has some reason where he doesn't want to use Baz, and maybe he is a little afraid of Baz trying to take revenge on him. But despite all that, there's kind of this underlying interesting dynamic between the two of them too. They're supposed to be master-slave, right? But they're kind of just bickering, right? Bickering back and forth like an old married couple. I mean, we heard back in Chapter 2, it was a special privilege, supposedly, for Tax to be able to talk directly to Deliritous. Mostly, speakers are supposed to keep their mouths shut unless someone addresses them. But Baz doesn't seem to have too much problem kind of going back and forth with Deliritous. He does catch himself, he's glaring at Deliritous and then he kind of looks to the side when he figures out, but he's not necessarily being submissive here either, right? So, just interesting, and you wonder if a different reader would maybe put up with Baz the way Deliritous does. All right, so finally, kind of Deliritous pays the price here for his obliviousness, right? They draw the attention of the vicar, right? Who he is the conservator who is leading the questioning of the cityless. We learn vicars are members of the Conservatory who specialize in studying the mysteries of the scribes, as Baz puts it. So they're kind of like they're the zealots, right, of this already religious institution. They study the scriptures, right? But beyond that, they also kind of play this unofficial role of being torturers, right? So they're kind of like the hand of the light in Wheel of Time, right? The questioners, or if you're not a Wheel of Time fan out there, think like an inquisitor from the Spanish Inquisition. There, the vicars, they use religion as kind of a cover for their cruel methods, right? So that's not really a unique invention by me here, but that gives you kind of a reference point. So our vicar here, his name is Vintas, and he, another unsettling character here, right? He's got his sleeves rolled up, he's covered in blood splatters, so he's obviously been going at this cityless for a while. And so he's not someone you really want to get called out by in public, right? Deliritous kind of wilts under his scrutiny. His voice cracks, right? This guy, he's 23 and the heir to, we know Torchsire is not very well off, but he's still the heir to one of the powerful institutions in this city, but he, voice cracks when he's apologizing to the vicar. And the vicar kind of capitalizes on this, right? He asks if he can borrow rocks for a minute to help in the questioning, which is really, this seems like another faux pas, right? That Baz points out. Baz's analogy, which I think is a good one here in modern day. It's like asking someone to help you move a big piece of furniture, right? You need to, no one wants to move that big piece of furniture, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm just a bad person, right? But no one really wants to help move furniture. But you kind of look like an ass if you decline to help. And this is kind of the same thing here. So the Harbors are bodyguards, and we're just surrounded by other readers, right? You don't have any enemies here, so there's no real reason to, you don't need your bodyguard around us. So it's kind of the same thing. You don't want to give your bodyguard away, but if you refuse, then it's kind of like, well, what, dude? You think you need your bodyguard around us? So it's kind of like one of these questions you ask where the person can't really say no without looking like an ass, even though you should be able to say no to it. And maybe you get a little feeling here too that Baz isn't the only one who doesn't respect Deliritous, right? You don't see the vicar asking Marla Kolnar to use her harbor, right? They're picking on Deliritous here. So, regardless, Rox goes over to help the vicar, right? He's yanking up the cityless's chain, forcing the man to, look up again and answer the questions here. The vicar insists again, where did you learn to read? And the home of the scribes, the cityless says, which apparently doesn't mean anything to Baz, but Deliritous explains he means tome. Again, tome, which this is the ruined city, right? That seems to have been destroyed in the burning that happened in the prologue. And Baz, when the cityless says this, Baz is like, oh, well, this guy's gone mad from the torture, right? Tome was raised over 300 years ago. It's nothing more than a big pile of rubble now. So obviously there's no way the cityless could have learned to read there. So it sounds like he's just kind of raving about nothing here. And again, we're not coming right out and saying it, but we've heard about Tome and the burning, and this just more evidence. If you weren't convinced already, it was the burning that was happening in the prologue. So there you go. I don't think that's much of a spoiler here at this point, and you can certainly see why no one in the room, including the vicar, believes he actually learned to read there at Tome. There's nothing there. You might see a dragon or two there. Oh, that's right. The vicar just kind of tosses that in, right? Well, we send people out there. We see dragons sometimes, but no people who could teach you to read. So I guess hidden in there, I didn't even really think of this until now, but we learned no one's seen a book dragon since the burning, right? So there must be other types of dragons other than the book dragons, right? Because the vicar does say we occasionally see dragons out there in the ruins. And the vicar, despite not getting an answer to his questions, he's almost pleased, right? He's obviously got kind of a, he's getting a little bit of a sick streak in him, right? He likes doing this torture stuff. It's not just a job for him.
And obviously Marla, Marla seems to be competing with him for who can take greater enjoyment in this torture, right? She is more than happy to hand over this dagger that she has, so the torturer can use it on the cityless. So, not nice people here, not at all. And of course, this dagger becomes very relevant very quickly here. We've read the chapter, so everyone knows what happens next now. Rox yanks on the chain, and this time it snaps. Oh no. And if you were paying close attention, I did kind of stick in there right when Baz first entered. It was an old, rusty chain. So I set up very subtly that this could happen, that the chain could break, and obviously Rox is as close to a giant as people come. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that Rox could snap this rusty chain, right? So Rox yanks on the chain, it snaps, he goes flying backwards, right? If you pull up on a chain and you suddenly lose tension, you're gonna go falling. So that kind of takes Rox out of the action for a minute now. And the vicar is also startled. He falls back, and he drops the knife. And so everyone's kind of like frozen and not sure how to act for a second. And the cityless sees his chance, right? He is going to go attack the nearest person in this room of people who have been torturing him for who knows how long. And of course, good old Deliritous, he is the closest person. And then the cityless still has his chains attached to his wrists, and he starts flailing them around. Deliritous manages to dodge them, so his other speaker, this Delilah, takes it in the throat, right? She's tossed backwards. Baz thinks she's dead, right? And then the cityless picks up the knife and he charges Deliritous. And it, Deliritous. Turns out on top of everything else, he's a bit of a coward, right? Baz says he's taken fencing lessons, but Deliritous just kind of holds up his hands and cowers, and he screams, right? He's like, he's not going to save himself. So Baz he's got a situation, his dream's about to come true, right? He just said he dreams of Deliritous jumping off Xavier Tower, so he doesn't have to deal with him anymore. And Deliritous is about to eat it here, right? This cityless is going to, stab him with the dagger. But, maybe we learned Baz wasn't totally in earnest when he said that, right? Baz takes quick stock of the situation here. So they got Rox. He's peeling himself off the floor. He's not going to be able to help Deliritous. And no one else is moving to help him either, right? Everyone else, like I said, everyone is supposedly on the same side here, but Baz really sees how it is. They're all really competitors, and none of the other readers here are going to be too upset if Deliritous is killed. That's one less person for them to compete with, right? And that just doesn't sit right with Baz. We've seen, Baz has a conscience here, right? He talks a big talk, but he's a bit of a softy underneath. And he's actually annoyed with himself, right? It's like, why am I happy that Deliritous is about to die? He says, the text says, Baz ought to have felt satisfaction at that, Deliritous falling victim to the same societal mores that had victimized Baz's brother. But instead, Baz found a hollow emptiness in his gut. Right. He helped the lady with the chicks, right? And then he at least tried to help that illet with his door. And now he's going to save Deliritous, despite how much he dislikes him. Baz sticks the foot out. He trips the cityless, saves Deliritous. Even though, the knife goes whizzing past Deliritous' head. My efforts were almost wasted. Almost gets stabbed by the knife anyway. But no, Deliritous survives, and those few seconds that Baz buys, it's enough for Rox to recover. And, we see kind of in person for the first time how vicious Rox can be. As Baz puts it, he punches the cityless in the face with his razor. But remember, this razor is like a 3-foot long saw made of steel. So if you get punched in the face with this thing, it's not pretty. Basically the guy's head explodes when Rox punches him, right? Splattering blood everywhere. And then, as the chapter closes, just for an instant, Deliritous, just for an instant, we think maybe he's got a little bit of humanity in them, right? He jumps up and runs over to his fallen speaker, Delilah, the one who got hit by the chain. He's concerned, right? It sounds like he's concerned. Oh, Delilah, speak to me. That's what he says when he runs over to her. she responds and her voice is all messed up, right? She just got hit in the throat by a chain. My voice would be messed up too. I wouldn't be doing this podcast right now, right? But we quickly see Deliritous wasn't actually concerned about her, right? It's just thinking about himself. Remember, she was supposed to go on the trials with him, but if she can't speak, she's not much use to him, right? Speakers are all about talking. Deliritous says, "Oh, your voice." Again, even when he says that, well, maybe he's still concerned. But then, what will I do for the trials if you can't speak? And then the chapter ends with this creepy reader, Marla, the tumor Marla, right? Marla is, over there cackling in the background at Deliritous' misfortune. Remember, she's one of his competitors at the trials, right? So she's pleased to see one of her competitor speakers go down before the competition has even started. And just kind of reinforcing here, right, what Baz said at the beginning, how, she doesn't care for her fellow readers, or at least the readers don't care for each other, right? They're just in competition. And that's really it. Just one last thing to note. I skipped over this a little here. Just store away what that Cityless said before he charged Deliritous, right? What is it? Declaimer's Transcendence. Declaimer's Transcendence. Well, what is that? And, Baz obviously has no idea. So it's the Declaimer's Transcendence. He cried out like a madman. He'll speak the words to set us free. And then he runs at Deliritous. No time to consider that in the moment. The action was happening in real time there. So Baz, wonders about it for a second, and then we don't really dwell on it anymore. And at this point, we kind of just think the Cityless is raving, right? But we're gonna just store that away. The Declaimer's Transcendence. That's not the last time we're gonna hear that phrase. So keep that in mind in the weeks to come. It'll be relevant again here soon. And then that's really it. We're done with chapter 4. So next week we're going to read 2 chapters, 5 and 6. So maybe it's looking like maybe episodes are just going to be an hour long. I don't know. Send me, leave me a comment or shoot me an email. How do you feel about the length of these episodes so far? You like having the long form, or do I need to cut it back a little? Still getting my feet under me a little here with the podcasting. So definitely happy to tailor it however you find it most enjoyable and useful. But in chapters 5 and 6, we will return to Torchsire Library, and like I hinted at earlier, we're going to see some readers fighting each other, and we will learn some more interesting details about the dynamic between reader, speaker, and Harbour. And then after that, we are going to meet the Duke for the first time, Deliritous' father, so the Duke of Torchsire Library. What do you think of him? What does Baz think of him? And, let me know too. Do we finally, for the first time, have some reason to feel bad for Deliritous, or no? Do we still just hate Deliritous? Let's see how you feel about that after chapter 5. And then we are going to see. We could debate this a little too, but I think it's the inciting incident of the story. I think happens in chapter 5. In retrospect, maybe you could say it already happened here in chapter 4, or you could maybe even argue it hasn't quite happened. It doesn't even happen in this part 2. It doesn't happen until part 3. I think that would be less of an argument, but let's see. Maybe I'll make a note to discuss that next week. What do you think the inciting incident is? But I bet you guys can see where this is going, right? We got the name of the book, right? The Acktus Trials. So, and Baz is our main character. So, you can probably guess. But if not, don't worry. We'll find out here soon, next week. And then chapter 6, we're going to read 2. Relatively short, but we see kind of an interesting interaction between Deliritous and his uncle, shedding some light on the challenges Deliritous is going to face at the trials. And then we see Baz and Deliritous have their first kind of true interaction besides their bit of bickering there down in the torture chamber. And kind of no surprise, that doesn't go terribly well. But we do learn some other interesting tidbits about the magic system during that interaction, so look out for that. So that's your homework for this week, and As usual, remember, if you don't do it, it's okay. You all get A+ just for tuning in. Participation trophies and report cards for everyone. I will be reading all of it for you in the next episode and answering all these questions and more. Right. So the quest for this week, and just a reminder, I'm still accepting answers to the quests from episodes 1 through 3. I'll be accepting those until the first episode in March, where we'll be declaring the first ever D.T. Kane's Fantasy Book Club quest victor. So get those answers in. There will be some glorious prize for the winner. So get those answers in, dtkane@dtkane.com. For this week, I'd like you to send me your favorite excerpt from Chapter 4. Maybe this is maybe this is a bit self-serving for me, but it's my podcast, so I'd like to hear what you're thinking here. I think Baz had some particularly entertaining one-liners in this chapter, and I wasn't able to touch on all of them, so that'd be interesting to hear. Did you like one of the ones I discussed in this episode, or maybe there was one I missed? And you found it particularly entertaining, or if you read something that you thought was interesting or profound or thought-provoking, you can send that to me as well. It doesn't have to be something funny. One experience point for everyone who emails me an answer, and this is easy experience, right? All you gotta do is send me something, and you'll get the point here. So keep those emails coming, and that's all except for our quote that we end with every week. And this week we went with Mr. Tolkien, the father of modern epic fantasy, right? Author of Lord of the Rings and a bunch of other books. So, Jrr Tolkien once said, "Fantasy is escapist, and that is its glory. If a soldier is imprisoned by the enemy, don't we consider it his duty to escape? If we value the freedom of mind and soul, if we're partisans of liberty, then it's our plain duty to escape and to take as many people with us as we can." So, let's see. By reading fantasy, you are promoting freedom of the mind and the soul and liberty for others. So, spread the word of fantasy, all you listeners out there. Help free some minds and souls. And if you want to free your mind and soul next week, be sure to tune back in to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. And until next time, I will talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Baz certainly didn't get involved in politics, but one would have to be blind, deaf, and likely dead. Oh, geez, I'm feeling dead today. The hall's center was occupied by a spiraling staircase. Whoa! Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.